One of my absolute favorite people is back on the show today to talk about one of the number one questions I get asked when I'm in schools. How do we authentically integrate student questions? Trevor is giving us a sneak peek into his newest book, Inquiry Mindset Question Editions, and we're learning all about the questioning routines, how he came up with them, and how they help us to better implement student questions into every stage of the learning. I came away with a brand new favorite term, question competence, and with lots of new insight into the importance of questions and how we form deep and rich learning experiences with our students. You're not going to want to miss this one. So, without further ado, let's jump into my conversation with Trevor McKenzie. Welcome to the School Leaders Project. Trevor, I am so excited to have you back on the show. Thanks for being here. So I saw on LinkedIn and a post and it was like, I've got my new book coming out. And I got so excited, Trevor, because all of your books are just so amazing and practical and just beautifully written. So can you tell us a little bit about where the inspiration for this new book came from?
Yeah, this new book is about question routines. There are 10 high impact question routines, and these question routines are really specific structures that I suggest teachers implement to help their students become more competent questioners, to ask deeper questions, but also just understand how questions can shape learning. And so these question routines are structures that I've been using in my own classroom, that I've been designing, I've been using in classrooms and schools I support around the world. And really it came from the need of kind of teachers saying, questions aren't working, or students don't ask deep questions, or students are complacent with questions. I say, what questions do you have? And they kind of shrug their shoulders. Or even there's that teacher sentiment of, well, I have questions now what do I do with them?
Yes.
And so in my own practice, working with students and in the schools I support, really focusing on how can we kind of fill those holes in our practice and then more authentically support student questions in shaping the learning landscape of which we kind of facilitate with them.
It's the number one question that I get in schools without fail is how to do this well. And I think especially in the world of ChatGPT and in the world of AI, the value of questions becomes infinitely more valuable. So I think your timing on this is just stellar.
Thank you. Well, it is out of need, right? It's partly, I think it is AI. Partly, I think schools around the world are shifting to a landscape that is much more in partnership with students. And if we want to partner with students, one skill we need to strengthen, we need to elevate, we need to sharpen is the skill of questioning. We need to build question competence. So I think as AI is becoming more prominent in our lives and in our students' lives and in our classrooms, as well as just where classrooms are going around the world, question routines are really timely, and I can't wait to gift this book to the world. I'm just so excited to talk about it with you, but to get it out there eventually.
I love it. Okay, so let's dig into the nitty gritty, Trevor. This might seem kind of basic, but can you talk about the importance of an authentic student question in the role of inquiry?
Yeah, well, no, it's a nitty gritty, but it's really important. Well, questions are a byproduct of curiosity. So I just want to highlight that right away. If we have student questions, it means we've gotten them curious or they're coming in curious. And so I don't want to overlook that. I think something I write about in the publication is these 10 question routines, in order for them to blossom, in order for them to be implemented strongly, we need a strong provocation repertoire. We need to ensure that our students are genuinely excited about what they're learning about. So I think, as we think about curiosity, we know there are benefits to curiosity. When our kids are curious, they do better in school. When our kids are curious, they tell us some amazing things about school. And we talked about this in the first podcast episode, actually. There's a stronger sense of belonging, a stronger sense of engagement, a stronger sense of meaning. Those feelings really matter. We can't overlook our students' feelings in terms of the outcomes that we want for them. We want agency-rich experiences of high relevance. And so for me, the importance of student questions is, broadly speaking, a more authentic inquiry experience that really is driven by students and by their questions rather than ours, rather than mine. I want to create student question competence so their questions can really be a roadmap to exploring our curriculum through.
Beautiful. Well, because as they enter their real lives, they're not going to have that guide on the side, that facilitator. So if students don't come out of school with the ability to ask important questions and the skill set to answer them, then we're not serving them well.
No, there's a thread of critical thinking through all this, isn't there?
Yes.
By asking big questions, the next step is we begin to grapple with, well, what are the resources that help me answer these questions, and how do I triangulate these
Yes.
resources to make sense of what it is I'm learning about? And then what other questions bubble up? Where does my learning spiral back to as we're engaging in this learning experience together? So there's a through
Adore
line
it.
of critical thinking to the question routines. And as you said, these routines transfer, these routines are bigger than classroom experiences. They're lifelong skills. We want to prepare our students for the world of tomorrow and the classrooms of today by creating question competence. Again, I'll go back to that phrase over and over again. Question competence for our students.
It's a new term for me, and I'm gonna steal it and add it into my
Please
vernacular.
do.
So thank
Absolutely.
you. So Trevor, you're always in schools. You're in the classroom. You're working with teams,
Yeah.
and I think we talked about this a bit before, that questions often are a sticking point for teachers. So where are the places that you find we get stuck with questions?
Yeah, a number of places. Sometimes we get stuck in that student questions aren't about the curriculum. They may ask questions, but they're
Mm,
not necessarily curricular focused. Some teachers will say, well, they're asking questions that are off topic. And that's not problematic. If we want students asking questions about the curriculum, we need to provide the conditions for them to do so, either through provocation or a deeper understanding of statements of inquiry or the concepts of which we're exploring. So if we want students asking questions about the curriculum, that's an us thing, not a them thing. But
mm,
that's one sticking point for sure. And student generated questions in the classroom is they're not about the curriculum.
mm,
Another one is that question complacency that often turns up, especially in the high school setting. It's that notion of we ask students what kind of questions they have about the learning, or what questions could shape our learning. And we get a lot of shrugged shoulders. We get a lot of, well, just tell me what you want me to do, and
yeah.
tell me the pathway, give me the worksheet. And that, if that happens, that's just an indicator that, to be honest, we're on the right track, that the question routines are actually surfacing feelings that we need to grapple with and we need to explore, because agency sometimes is a forgotten notion with some students. They haven't felt agency in learning for a
Mm,
while, and they've gotten used to jumping through hoops and playing certain games. And so question complacency could bubble up from time to time. And we lean into that. We actually approach that more through
mm.
question routines. So if teachers see question complacency, that's not a sign to stop. That's a sign to lean in and go further with the question routines to create more excitement, agency, and sense of relevance for our students. So those are some big ones that surface for me, Cindy.
It was it just triggered something in me. I was just talked with Ron Richart, and this quote, he said, what are we doing that's disincentivizing curiosity? And I think your
Mm-hmm.
book gets to the heart of this, of potentially we've had routines, or it's been, okay, you've asked your questions, they're not related to the curriculum, so let's get back to what we're really doing. And this is, so I think it's such a beautiful question to ask ourselves early on. What are the routines that are disincentivizing curiosity, and how do we make sure that they're really relevant and getting pulled forward?
Yeah, yeah. I do a lot of work with schools and school leaders around identifying our values,
Beautiful.
and what are our little handful of values that are both our north star and our starting point. Like that's what we
Yes.
believe in, and that's where we're going. And nested underneath that little handful of values are a series of protocols and frameworks and routines that are aligned with those values. What
Hmm.
are the structures and protocols that show students that we're actually planning learning, where those values are flourishing, where they're revealed? And conversely, and perhaps a little bit more, nudgy here, what are routines and values and protocols that are misaligned to those values? You
Yes.
said desensitizing. No, de-
Disincentivizing. It's a tongue
thank you.
twister.
Thank you. And the notion that there are misaligned values that do just that, stifle the thing we value. If we value curiosity, what are structures that stifle that? This is important for us to grapple with. What are some leaders and teachers? What are some things we want to let go of? What are some things that we can't let go of that are in contrast to the values? So at least we can paint the picture for staff that, there's this standardized test, or there's this map test, or there's this outcome over here. We can't
Mm,
ignore that. But when we're approaching that, this may feel in opposition to our values. To hear a leader say that to a group of teachers is so liberating. It lets them
yes.
know that the leader has their back. The leader understands the values are not being demonstrated in this particular protocol, framework, or routine, excuse me. So, what you mentioned there about the values really struck true to me in terms of what are misaligned protocols and aligned protocols. And of course, I propose that question routines are aligned protocols.
Love it, Trevor. I just love that you come back to values so often in our
Yeah.
conversations. I think that's where you and I have like a very shared heart. It's just in that essential nature of values towards growth and development. So
It's so grounding, Sydney. Like if we know where our feet stand, it allows some of those harder conversations and perhaps harder decisions to actually be softened around the corners. It allows us to have more honest, succinct, values driven conversations, and allows us to move forward in a common direction, which is incredibly important because schooling and teaching, it's a really hard profession. And
right.
if we can have our ground on the same, or our feet on the same surface, I think we can go common places really a lot more smoothly.
This is so dorky, but it's hard work, but it's heart work.
Oh, it's
Oh.
true. Very true. Very true.
Okay, so the $1,000,000 question, and I think this is the one I get the most, is my students are forming just really surface level questions. It's just like they hear the central idea or they hear what you're learning about and they just parrot it back to you basically because they think that's what you want to hear. So,
Yeah.
how do we'll get into your specific routines, but generally, best practices, how do you get students to ask those deeper, richer, meaty questions?
Yeah, well, a foundational step is we want to co-design indicators of what open-ended questions are and closed-ended questions. I think that's imperative. Do students understand what is meant by an open-ended question? Let's ask
Yes.
them. Like when open-ended question is in your mind, when I say that phrase, what language comes up? And students will say the darndest things. They'll give you evidence and indicators that let you know that they know what open-ended questions are, and conversely, what closed-ended questions are. And so what we need to do is crack open those phrases with our students, quite literally create a list, a co-designed list of indicators for each. And now we have a bit of a blueprint, a bit of a rubric that we can reflect towards from the questions students are asking. So a student won't just parrot back a question. And if they do, we can look at those indicators that we co-designed and reflect on our questions and begin to revise them. This takes time. Like
Yes.
undeniably, I'm going to spend time building these indicators, asking students to revise their questions, but I'm going to get to a different place in terms of question competence by sitting in this and learning like this. Conversely, if I don't do this work, I'm always going to get what you referred to as those parroting questions, those shallower questions. And I'm never going to get to a place where the inquiry is more authentically driven by student generated questions. There's going to be a tipping point. I'm going to invest time, but all of a sudden the ownership over the questions and the ownership over the learning is so in partnership with your scholars that the time invested is getting us to different places and different outcomes and experiences that I couldn't have gotten to unless I invested in those early moves. So co-designing indicators and then sitting and revising questions is a really healthy move initially to get into more rich questioning routines and creating a culture of questioning in the inquiry setting. Does that make sense, Sydney? I threw a lot at you there.
You did well, and I love it. I guess the big question I have coming away from it is, do you have a list of those indicators? Because when I ask teachers, often the answer is an open question is a non-Googleable question, which I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, do you have a list of those indicators in your book, or is that something that you suggest teams do together, is create those? Like, where might I start if I'm not sure what an open question is?
Yeah, both. So in the publication, there are lists for both open-ended and closed-ended, and the
Great.
list is nice and long. So yes, ungoogleable question is in there and Googleable question is in there. That's an indicator. But gosh, there are like 20, 25, 30 other indicators for both open and closed. But also, even if those indicators exist in the book, I would suggest start with your team and start
Mm,
with your students and see if you could build those with them first. I often
yes,
suggest teachers print off that page in the book
and
so that
have it.
they can refer to it as their little blueprint through that co-design conversation. They can reflect, what are my students getting and what aren't they getting? And then what
Cool.
questions can I ask to see if I can nudge them there and get a little bit closer to there?
Mm,
So that would be a good start point. Obviously, look in the book, look at those indicators, but just because they're there in the book doesn't mean we rob yourselves or your students away from that rich learning of trying to grapple with indicators yourselves and building those together. The togetherness that comes from co-designing, the sharing of ideas and showing interest in one another ideas, we just can't overlook that as being imperative to more authentic inquiry.
Beautiful. All right, let's get into your question routines, Trevor. I'm
Yay.
curious a little bit about like the story, the history of these. Are they just something you came up with overnight, or kind of where'd they come from?
Yeah, well, I'm very much a visual learner myself, so that's my
I
bias.
never would have guessed. Looking at your books, never.
And when I look at how to make sense of different ideas, helping students organize those ideas and map them out has always been something that I've been tinkering with, I've been mindful of. And so quite literally, the first question routine that surfaced in my own practice with my own students, it was an inverted triangle, and we call this the question triangle. So it's an inverted triangle. So the top layer is really, really broad, and of course with an inverted triangle it goes to a sharper point. And I just put 3 bands across this triangle, and I asked students to organize their questions into these 3 bands,
Hmm.
from close-ended questions at the top, the biggest band, to their more open-ended questions at the sharp end of the triangle at the bottom. And that shift in how we organize questions, it was just, you could see it was transformational in a moment. Students all of
Hmm.
a sudden had really clear kind of bands that they were organizing their questions into. They were invited to get out of their seats and come to the whiteboard and talk with one another, and the sharing of ideas and the collaboration and clear communication and critical thinking that was happening in the moment. I was like, this is actually working. And
Okay.
so quite literally their questions were mapped out into this inverted triangle, and it was just formative assessment in action. Like I had this really clear understanding. Did they map these out accordingly?
Hmm.
Are there any misconceptions? What can I do next year? What questions can I ask them to consider how to move these around? And then the biggest shift for me happened when I started to organize those questions with them to guide our next steps.
Hmm.
So if you can imagine this one, Cindy, that inverted triangle is something we turn. We actually take that triangle and we pivot it 90 degrees so it becomes an arrow. So the sharpest end of the triangle is now the direction of the inquiry. And those open
Oh,
ended questions, that's kind of where we're going in the inquiry. And so when I first did that pivot move with my particular
you were like,
scholars, I was really impressed. Pat on my back. The oohs and ahs that happened with 17-year-old students, it was hilarious. But the point being is, it all of a sudden made sense. All this
hmm,
talk about the importance of close leading to open and questions shaping our learning,
so
the
abstract.
directionality, it just made sense to students. And everything after
Hmm.
that in terms of how our questions were leading the learning, it was just much more clearly understood, and there was a much clearer partnership because of that organizing and sorting of questions. So for me, the first routine came out of my own selfish place, my classroom, and my own bias, a really clear structure. And then since then, and that was roughly 4 years ago, since then, we've just been mapping these out across different contexts, across different schools. There's one routine that was birthed out of a gifted classroom, and myself
Hmm.
and a colleague that teaches gifted students, we are grappling with how to get our students thinking about questions along the spectrum of higher order thinking. And then what I thought was going to be a question routine for merely gifted students has now been used in contexts in classrooms, around the world and across grade levels and schools. And so what I've
Hmm.
learned through this process is I have a lot to learn, number one.
Yeah.
And, we need to check our biases and our misconceptions at the door and just really use these routines to see what our students say, what they believe, what their misconceptions are themselves, and how we can coach through these routines as formative assessment, Sydney.
One question I have is that to me, these kinds of routines, you hit on that it's not an activity, but really it's a shift and a change in practice.
Mm.
So, what do you think are those key mindsets and skill sets of somebody who's adopting this in their school?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right away, I think of just well planned teachers. Teachers who understand that in order for this to be a more authentically student driven inquiry, I need to insert certain structures that
Right.
help students see how their ideas matter, and we could take those ideas and map them out. And that doesn't happen by accident. We just don't open up the classroom and say, go for it, kids. I'll follow you wherever you want to go. You know, Teachers who know agency is authentic and richly received are teachers who are very well planned.
Hmm.
And so teachers who are using question routines, they really appreciate these routines because they fit in that well planned mindset. we're very explicit about our plan. We're very explicit and intentional on how we plan for learning. And so question routines go right alongside that. I think another disposition that I think of, Cindy, is question routines go alongside teachers who are very observant and listen to the learning. I think of triangulating assessment, not to confuse shapes here, but triangulating assessment. And what I mean by triangulating assessment, if we can imagine a triangle with 3 points, at one point of the triangle, we have observation. At another point of the triangle, we have conversation. And at another point of the triangle, we have product. So observation, conversation, and product. And so how are we designing learning so that all 3 corners are kind of surfacing in the experiences before us? As students are having conversation in the question routine, for example, we're able to observe and listen and use that formative evidence right there to provide timely feedback towards creating a product. And in this case, the product is filling the question routine and having it map out some next steps, but also product is in ongoingly our learning across the inquiry. So teachers who are adopting question routines and not adopting them blindly, one thing they're really good at is observing and listening to the learning before them and using that to guide next steps as formative evidence. And, I'd say another disposition is just we're playfully minded, right? It's like, I'm going to try on this structure. I'm going to see how it goes. I'm going to watch my students. I'm going to take this data. I'm going to reflect on it. And then if it doesn't go as I hoped it would go, I'm going to give it another go and see how it goes differently the next time. And what we should see is, again, question competence being built. The more our students engage in these routines, the stronger questioners they should become over time. Does that make sense, Cindy?
It makes so much sense. And it reminds me of something Kath said in our chat, of that there's in inquiry environments, there's like a beautiful symmetry that goes on between leadership, teacher, and classroom, that like if we want our students to be curious, we have to be curious about our students. And that's what I'm hearing, is that this gives a structure to that teacher curiosity about our learners' curiosity.
Yeah, and to align that, Ron talks a lot about showing an interest in ideas.
Yeah.
Showing a vehement interest in student ideas and student interests. And question routines, quite literally, are a structure to allow us to sort those questions, organize them, and show interest in ideas. Like, could you imagine standing in front of that filled triangle and putting a finger to your chin and showing your genuine curiosity and what's bubbled up in your students' thinking, and how that shifts the culture of learning towards more curious spaces as opposed to complacent spaces. So showing an interest in ideas, showing curiosity around one another's curiosity through the whole school. You had mentioned from leaders to teachers to classrooms. Again, if we want certain outcomes for our students, teachers, and leaders, we need to be embracing those dispositions and those outcomes ourselves.
Just love it. So much symmetry, my friend. One thing I found really cool, and this might just be because it's a personal inquiry of mine, I've been learning a lot about like embodied cognition and how we can use our environment, our hands, our bodies to interact. And that was so present in the language in your book, was
Thank
like
you.
this idea of using our bodies. Can you talk a little bit about where that thinking comes from, or just any insights you might have there?
Well, I'm the father of 2 boys, and so I'm going to start there. My boys like to move. My boys like to get up. They like brain breaks, is what they like to call them.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered how we could weave more of that into our learning design, how we could take the learning vertical. I think of Peter Liljedahl's work and building thinking classrooms, and an underpinning of building thinking classrooms is vertical learning, where scholars are at spaces around the room and they're attacking different math problems. And by standing and leaning into their learning, quite literally leaning into the wall and leaning into one another's curiosity, something different happens in the learning. They're more engaged, they're more collaborative, and it's formative assessment in action. As the students stand and go to these stations, we actually have a clear view of the learning that's happening before us.
That is the biggest misconception that I think in the next 5 years will be shaken in education, is this idea that thinking is something that only happens in our brains. That thinking is something we do with our entire body. It's something that we do with others. And there's so much cool research coming out on this now. So to have a practical application of that, I think so many times it's easier to get the practice and then work back to the theory. So I just thank you for bringing that idea so tangibly into our community.
Well, thank you for nudging the conversation. And I also think there's a certain element of we've been stuck in me learning rather than we learning.
Yeah.
The notion that my learning is on the page here and it's done in isolation, and I
Well,
own
both
it
of
and I
us.
hide it and I don't share it. And the moment we make it a we experience, there's a transformation there. There's an opportunity for us to learn from one another's ideas, to ping pong ideas, to make connections, to see differences of opinion and grapple with those, and also make it active, make it physical, make it around the room so that evidence is visible in the setting so that we can revisit it and reflect on it ongoingly across learning. So I really appreciate the nudge, and I look forward to what the next 5 years around the science and the research tells us about embodied learning. It's an exciting time in education, and I couldn't agree more. I think we have as we always do, we have a lot to learn, but I think
Always.
that's one pathway that is going to illuminate a lot of changes in our practice in the coming decade.
Couldn't agree more. I'd love to pivot now to this idea. You mentioned earlier in our talk, Trevor, that oftentimes, I think you mentioned two sticking points. One is that the questions don't have depth, and the other is that we get the questions and we kind of don't know what to do with them. So, do you have advice for how we authentically take questions forward in an inquiry? Like, we've gathered them, they're great. Now what?
Yeah, yeah. Well, one piece I ask teachers to consider, of course, is who are their learners? Like, what are their interests, and
Mm,
can their interests be, entry points into the curriculum? And there are some curricula around the world that are just so liberating. They're just so freeing that there's a lot of space for student-generated interests
right.
to be pathways into the curriculum. I was talking to one group of teachers this morning, in fact, and the content standard was not tied to a specific historical event. The
Love it.
content standard was actually tied to a concept. And so there's actually a lot of choice in where in history we explored that concept. So the teachers backwards designed the exploration of that concept from student interests. Students were really interested in, of all things, World War One. And so the teacher was
Let's
willing to
do
take the
it.
learning there, and the concept lives there, and the teacher expertise can go there, but the
Yes.
entry point was student interest. So if you have a liberating curriculum, or if you have standards that aren't really, really specific, how can you get student interests to take you to those standards? I think that's an
Mm,
obvious move. Conversely, plan provocation towards your standards. Like, whatever your provocation
yes.
is, tailor your provocation as entry points to the curriculum. A really brilliant move that you can make as students are asking questions is just give them a word bank of some of that standardy language. And when I say standardy
Mm,
language, look at your standards and what's some language, some academic jargon that you hope students would ask as they're writing their questions down. And by
beautiful.
having a little word bank of 10, 12 terms, students are going to look at that word bank, look at the provocation, and before you know it, the questions that they're asking are actually, wow, really aligned to the curriculum. So there's not that feeling of, oh, we're not getting there. The last point I'd like to make, though, Cindy, is avoiding that conundrum, avoiding that space of, ooh, what's happening here with the questions, and are they taking us there? Aren't they taking us there? The challenge is not for us to avoid it. The challenge is for us to actually become more comfortable in sitting on that balance and standing there,
Mm,
and being reflective in the moment and being mindful of how we're guiding students to get there more. I think that the challenge that you raise is actually the stance we need to embrace and get more comfortable in. I think question routines help us sit in that space more comfortably, help us organize questions, and have students begin to see, oh, this question actually doesn't really
doesn't
belong
connect.
here.
Let
This
them
isn't a
sort it.
connecting question. And then they actually put it in the recycling bin rather than me, no, swipe left, swipe right. It's an us thing again rather than a me thing. And in sharing that learning load, guess what an outcome is? Students are becoming more question competent. Rather than me
Mm,
do the heavy lifting and robbing them of that experience, they're actually becoming more aware, more self-aware, and more question competent over time. So teachers listening, that balance is precisely the responsibility. Leaders listening, creating safe conditions for your teachers to live in that balance and that uncertainty, gosh, that's such a critical move that leaders can make. Just provide the safe conditions for living in that uncertainty and that riskiness, and say that's precisely it. If you're feeling it, that's precisely where we need to be, because you yourself are an aware practitioner around the learning that's happening right before you, moment to moment. Does that make sense, Cindy?
so much. I think what I'm hearing, just to kind of summarize, is I think zoom out conceptually and see, is there a way that these questions are connecting, maybe in a way I didn't even think before, and maybe there is a new path of inquiry. And if not, give opportunities to share that cognitive load of how might we sort these? What do you all think? Like, is this relevant? Does that
Yeah,
capture
yeah.
it?
And when you
Hey,
said zoom out, I saw quite literally all the questions in a structure on your whiteboard or an anchor chart. And you get to see all those questions and
yes,
have that sorting and thinking done together transparently, visibly. It's easier for me when they're visible, and it's better for the students because we're doing it together. So
mm,
when you said zoom out, I actually could see visibly in the classroom the questions that have been sorted. And when we use these routines, it becomes a lot easier to see how they lead to next steps in learning and how they create a bit of a path through the inquiry. So it's not just
yes,
a one-off thing where we do this question activity at the start. They actually create a roadmap for the first series of steps in inquiry. And then we can revisit them, the routines throughout inquiry, because as we learn, likely more questions are going to bubble up. Students are going to want to ask deeper questions or different questions as learning occurs. So initially, it's your first few steps of the inquiry. And then additionally, as we go back to the routines, you're going to see more clarity in what your next steps are throughout the inquiry.
it brings 2 points to mind. The first is that one of the things I often see in schools is these like static wonder walls. Like you go and you touch the post-its and they have dust on them, right? Because they were written 6 weeks ago. We haven't
Yeah.
touched them, looked at them
Or they were
since.
told you have to have a wonder wall in your classroom, and so teachers have one, but they're not really using it. Yeah.
Well, and it's just like the worst question is like, what is a tree? And you're like, what?
Yeah.
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 So I think that idea of it being this, like your walls are talking. It's this constant documentation that we're going back and we're shifting and we're moving. That to me was so cool that it's not a static space. The other thing I think it empowers is, have you ever noticed this, Trevor, that sometimes teachers get so excited about a question that they let it almost like sidetrack their entire curriculum. Like they're like, a thing that they would have done at the end of the unit once students had richer understanding, they're trying to jump and do that now because they want to be responsive. Like, is there a role of saying, this is a beautiful question and we're going to
Mm-hmm.
get to it in 3 weeks? Or like, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we table questions. We have a question shelf, and the question shelf isn't a vertical shelf. It's actually a space, a little box on the whiteboard where some of those
Hmm,
questions can go. If we know that they're
it's
likely to
coming.
bubble up later in the inquiry, we shelve those, we table those for now in anticipation of, because we know in our really intentional planning that that question is actually going to surface a little bit later in a more beautiful light. So we don't dismiss it. We don't crumple it up and toss it in the recycling bin. We put it on the question shelf. Sometimes those questions become our overarching questions. Sometimes we pull
Hmm,
them off the sticky note and we actually write them nice and large on the learning wall, and it's almost like it's going to be the guiding thing that we're
we're
going
going
back to,
there.
that we revisit. If we have a few of those, we can put a few of those up there to kind of be the umbrella for the learning wall. But absolutely, if the teacher is well planned, the teacher can kind of see where the learning is going to go in the coming days and weeks, and where the timeliness of certain questions is just going to be ripe and more fruitful. And if it's
Yes.
going to be kind of wasted and fruitless if we explore that now, partly because students may not have grappled with certain closed-ended questions soon enough to get to the richness that we hope they get to in that open-ended
Yes.
question. We see the promise, but guess what we have? We have the understanding of that the closed content, if you will. So we see the promise, but we don't want to rob our students of that currently.
Yes, facts build to understanding. And I think often when we're talking about inquiry and we're talking about concepts, people feel like, okay, I've got to get rid of topics and I've got to get rid of facts and case studies altogether. Such a
No.
misconception.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
get so much deeper and richer when we give ourselves the space to explore those rich,
Yeah.
meaty, topical examples.
Yeah, perhaps one of the most delicate chapters I've ever written is in this publication. It's a chapter around question misconceptions.
Oh,
And I
I
had
can't wait to
such a
read it.
hard time reading or writing this chapter because I really didn't want to offend any readers. I didn't want
Right.
any reader to think, oh, I had that belief, or oh, Trevor is telling me I'm wrong. And what I've realized is I need to shed light on some of the evidence that I've seen in schools that I've supported around some of those misunderstandings, some of those
Right.
missteps, so we can all learn from them. And so I've framed the chapter really through an inviting lens and a safe lens. But one misconception that surfaces is that closed ended questions are bad, or closed ended questions are not worthy of our time. And the reality is, if we don't explore the closed-ended questions, we can't get to the depth of the open. Conversely, open-ended questions are great. So all I'm going to do is explore open-ended questions, but students can't get to
Exhausting.
the depth without
Yeah.
the content of the close. So it is a both and more, and all of the question routines support that notion of let's map these out so we know the differences, and then we
Yes.
can begin approaching them and exploring them to get to a more balanced practice. I would say any classroom that's only doing closed-ended questions, ooh, not exactly balanced, is it?
Right.
Conversely, any classroom that's only doing open-ended questions, again, not exactly balanced. So we need to embrace that both and more mentality. And one way that I hope teachers do so is just understanding that close and open have a rich home in being together in the inquiry setting.
Well, and closed is often the interest. You know, like I tell the story of my student Noah, and he was like, that's it, civilizations unit, mummies. Finally, I'm going to learn about mummies. And then it's like, I know the concept is going to be civilizations across time. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
let's look at the terracotta warriors. Let's look at the Malagasy turning of the bones. Let's look at, different cultural expressions of death and the afterlife and expand that question so that we're looking at death and the afterlife across civilizations as opposed to mummies.
Yeah. Yeah. And, sometimes we do that in small groups or even individually, like that main man, Noah. We've all had a Noah, haven't we? And he just wants to explore mummies. But our challenge is, and his challenge is to come out of that deep dive into mummies and actually share it around the room with other deep dives into other really content close-ended spaces. But the students have to come out of that and attach it to the concept, attach it to the big idea. And so can he actually understand the differences and similarities between his case study and another and another and another in the class? And if they can make that transfer, then we've got some conceptual depth. But if they can't, that's again a me problem because I haven't structured the little deep dives to that overarching concept. So again, I don't mind if students want to learn about mummies, but as you've articulated, Cindy, can we come out of that and make a conceptual tie and then show concept transfer across those case studies? The well-planned teacher knows that and does that and is really aware of not letting it just end with mummies, right?
Yes. Don't just let it end with mummies. I want that on a t-shirt. Okay, a couple kind of higher level questions to end on here, Trevor. I'm going to read a quote from your book. So Trevor was gracious enough to give me 4 chapters of the book to read for this interview. And so I'm just nerding out over here. But you say, in order to teach differently and to adopt a stance different from what we typically do, we must first see the benefit of doing something differently. So what do you think are the greatest benefits you've seen of people taking that bold risk to do this differently?
Yeah, yeah. Undeniably, the first one is just more authentic inquiry. And what I mean by that is we know the 4 types of inquiry from shallow to deep, structured, controlled, guided, free. When I think of authentic inquiry, I mean more student-led, teacher-guided inquiry, where students are really taking on more ownership of the decision making. And in doing so, they have a skill set that allows them to do so, i.e., they have some question competence. So that authenticity in the learning is really important to me. I don't want a classroom to just be teacher-led inquiry all year long. I want to see a shift of agency. And in order to get that shift of agency, in order for it to be authentic, student-driven, students need to become more competent questioners. So that to me comes to mind right away. And then, these skills transfer into other settings. Like I just think that's such a beautiful thing. Like
It's
we're
the
talking about the
goal.
classroom context, but it just doesn't end in the classroom. By understanding how questions shape next steps, they can apply this to a myriad of contexts, a myriad of circumstances. And that to me is really deeply exciting, where the skills that we're sharpening and flexing in class can be applied to different settings. And then lastly, the notion of, oh gosh, what was it, Sydney? We'll have to edit it out. Oh, yeah, that's what it was. And lastly, the notion of just how these question routines make students feel. Like that's really exciting for me. If they feel a stronger sense of belonging, if they tell you they had more ownership over learning. Ownership isn't something I give. It's something that we create through the structures that we're learning in. And so if students tell me they have a stronger sense of belonging, it was more enjoyable. Dare I say it was fun. It was meaningful. It was
No.
relevant. Like all those
Yeah.
outcomes are just really, really exciting because byproducts of those outcomes are academic achievement. if those things are happening, students are going to do better in school. If those things are happening, students are going to be coming to school. So their feelings matter. And I don't say that, with a trite tone at all. I really appreciate how these routines actually reveal different experiences that students are having. So again, if we want something different, we need to do something different. And what are the things that I hope for? More authentic agency, transferable skill, and a different experience for our students so they have different feelings about schooling.
I love it. The book is Inquiry Mindset Question Edition, right?
You got it. Inquiry Mindset Questions Edition. Yeah, due out in June, hopefully June. And I can't wait to gift this book to the world. Again, you've said it repeatedly on this call. Implementational strategies are a heart of my practice, or the heart of my practice. And this includes 10 strategies that I just think are going to, transform student experiences in classrooms around the world. So grateful for you inviting me on to talk about it, Sydney. Thank you so much.
Trevor McKenzie, this book is going to change the world. So thanks for coming on to talk about it.
Thank you, my friend.